This oral history of museum computing is provided by Jeff Gates and was recorded on the 15th of February 2021 by Paul Marty and Kathy Jones.
Okay. My first snippet actually goes back to 1992 when I was teaching at the Maryland Institute College of Art. And I was teaching the very, very beginnings of computer graphics. I had migrated from, teaching college photography to computer graphics. I won't go into the details of that, but here is a story. One summer, the summer of 1992, I was teaching summer school at Carnegie Mellon, and I got in touch with the Center for Creative Inquiry there. They're still there. And they, at the time, remembered that the web started in about 1993. So this was about a year before, and we were, doing electronic bulletin boards and gophers. And I remember the very first images I saw online were of the Vatican's art collection. And I was actually just blown away, that this could actually happen. And now look what we're doing with Zoom. But anyway, they were looking and studying bulletin boards and gophers, and I came back to the Maryland Institute, and I immediately made an appointment with the dean, and I said, "Look, I don't know how it's going to happen, but the internet is going to change not just what we teach, but how we teach." And she goes, "I have no idea what you're talking about. Let's go talk to the president." So we made an appointment with the president, and I went through the same thing. And actually, the dean was very good. Barbara Price was her name. And she said, there are some teachers who got their MFAs 20 years ago and teach the same way that they were taught, people in painting and, the more traditional arts. Then there are younger people coming in from new programs who are starting to look at things differently. And then there are people like Jeff, who got his degree 20 years ago, but is looking, So listen to him. Anyway, so I did this, and the president's reaction was that this is not Carnegie Mellon. This is not a research institution. This will never happen here. And that was that until they built a brand new building full of digital classrooms, and while the people who funded the building, the Browns, have their name on the building, I feel I deserve a classroom named after me. I do have an AR project that I want to do where obviously they would never let me put up, a brass plaque in front of the president, who's no longer there, the president's office, saying all of this. So I want to do an AR project where you stand there and you see this brass plaque in your phone that says exactly what happened. So that's that's my introduction to my curiosity about how things work. And one thing, I was going over a number of articles I had written about museums and technology. And I'm a very curious person, and I'm very interested in process. And so I've always been interested in how we can make things happen. In this case, in the museum world, it's how can we take technology and use it in the museum, but also be able to convince the powers that be. And remember, we're talking about the early 2000s now. So at that time, all of our pages, all of our web pages were static. And so we had been thinking about how can we bring in new content? Chris Anderson had written in Wired Magazine about the long tail strategy, visionary, long tail strategy of Amazon, where if you look at the bestsellers, each page of their bestseller garners, hundreds of thousands of, looks and buys. But when you added up all of the purchases from the low end of the curve, they added up to more than the blockbusters. So the question early on was, how can we bring content to the surface? Uh, the other thing that was happening at the American Art Museum is we were closed for 6 years for renovation uh, from 2000 January 1st, 2000 to July 4th, 2006. And so the other question was is how while we're closed, what are we going to do? How are we going to remain open? We had a website, and in fact, Betsy Brune, who was the director back then, was a very early advocate of the technology, and we had a website in 1996, one of the first museums to do that. And so I had started blogging personally in 2001. And in 2002, I proposed doing a blog to our public affairs department. And you'll know from your experience in museums that some museums have marketing departments, some museums have public affairs departments, but oftentimes their goals are somewhat different than content producers' goals. Their goals are to get that information out there. So I proposed to the public affairs in 2002 that we do a blog, but it was premature. And so in 2004, I had two new bosses, and I proposed it again. And they were quite savvy in technology. I was lead producer of New Media Initiatives at the time, uh, and uh, and I had a lot of experience and with blogging itself. So we had a couple of challenges. Number one, we were closed and we were about to open, and everybody in the museum was focused on getting ready for the physical opening of our museum. So we were concerned about how people would see this new project, this unknown project, um, fitting into their workflow. The other thing was convincing the director that this was a way to go. And so, we worked together to look at the pros and cons, how to convey what we wanted to do. It seems very pedestrian now, but it was a very, very big deal back then. This was a very new way of doing things. We had been trying to do something like this with what was known back then as a "What's New" page, but we had no what's the word? We had no structure. Technology structure for doing that. Everything would have had to been by hand. So now we have blogging. I started blogging by doing it by hand, but then Typepad, other content management services started. And this allowed us to create time-based posts and allowed us to bring certain sort of hidden content back into the museum. So that was one of our first forays. We took it very slowly. Every blog post had to be approved by the director. And I remember in 2006, I was on I was on a panel at MCN with Robin from Robin from the Walker.
Robin Dowden?
Dowden, yes, Robin Dowden. See, this is what happens when you retire, you forget names. Anyway, and so we're on a panel, and when I said to the audience, every blog post has to be approved by a director, there, everybody's mouth dropped, and there was a, collective sigh. And Robin says, "Well, I don't even know that our director knows we have a blog." So, that in 2006, we started in 2005. We went live, and in 2006, that's a story that shows you the sort of breadth of how museums treated this new way of working. But it did allow us the ability to bring content to the surface. We had a lot of things to consider internally. We had, how are we going to convince people to buy into this? How are we going to organize blog posts? What did we want to blog about? Who was going to blog? And so I became, it wasn't planned, but I became the managing editor of the blog for 13 years. So we had a group of interested people from across the museum. We'd meet, I think we might have met at first once a week, then twice a week, then maybe once a month. But I was in constant communication with them. I was using Basecamp, where people would put up their blog posts. Another interesting issue in our museum is that the web editor was in the publications department. And one of the interesting things that speaks to this shift from an old way of working to a new way of working is that the editors in publications department were editing our blog posts as if it was a manuscript, as if it was a book, taking too long, questioning various words we used, maybe an issue of formality versus informality. So there was a learning curve through that. And, so we were going through, this seismic shift, as most places were. I do remember the very first time I announced to the Pan-Smithsonian group of tech people, we would meet once a month. And I announced, we had kept this to ourselves, close to the vest. We did not talk about this outside the museum, but when we were ready to launch, I made this announcement in one of these meetings, and everybody's jaw dropped again. And it was because everybody knew how difficult, this group especially knew how difficult it was to try something new. So that's sort of the start of social media in our museum. Are you going to now, Catherine? You said that I should just talk, but do you want to ask me questions before I have to look at some notes here. Hold on a minute.
Well, Jeff, I'll just jump in and say that, this whole point out whether your boss even knows you have a blog, right? This connects to an ongoing issue with MCN, right? About how savvy is your boss with respect to tech, and does that help or hinder the museum technology professional?
Yes. Well, I'm trying to decide how much of these inner workings I should, describe. I mean, I am retired.
You can cut them out later if you want.
Okay, okay. Well, our director uh, was she thought she knew a lot, and she had somebody who early on was teaching her what this could be about, and yet um, back when was it? Uh, um, we had an exhibition called, I think it was called America as West, or The West as America, and um, uh, and she allowed a fellow to write all of the captions without her even looking at them. And there was a huge controversy. If you look at books on museum controversies, it was a huge controversy because he wrote it from more of um, a Marxist point of view. And the comments, in the comment book and, all over the place, the idea of westward expansion, etc. So all of a sudden, she became a micromanager. She had not been a micromanager, but then she became one. And so this fit having to go through through her for every blog post. Now, very slowly, very, very slowly, that loosened up, and that's what we figured would happen is once that she trusted what we were doing, that would loosen up a bit. And it did loosen up. Um, um, it that was one of the challenges. I almost said problems, um, but the first thing I learned when I came to work at the museum was that you don't use the word problem. You use challenges and opportunity. And so anyway, the other thing is that from the very beginning, and this is not just at our museum, I'm sure, and if you haven't heard this already in the people you've talked to, you certainly will. But the biggest question was, how do we get curators to buy in to this? They were so focused on getting catalogs written, on getting their captions written, and these captions can take a year of approval, going through a workflow of approval, of organizing the exhibition. So how do you get them to be involved? What's and again, the trajectory of that was extremely, extremely slow and often very, very frustrating. But there were ways, that it happened here and there. So, for example, when we were approached by Google Arts and Culture to do some exhibitions, I don't think the first one was on African American art from our collection, but we did one there. That allowed us to work closely with the curator in a very short time frame because Google Arts and Culture never gave us enough time to really do this. So we were working very quickly, but the chance of having this exhibition on such a large platform was very inviting. So that was one way. Now, just thinking about it now, what we have tried to do for, what is it, 20 years, over 20 years, has come to pass. Why? Because of the pandemic. The pandemic has forced everybody online. So if you didn't have buy-in before then, you were forced to. You are forced to now. And so what will happen after this, I don't know. I would like to think that curators will be more comfortable with presenting their content online. So
Jeff, I was going to jump in and say we're having the exact same arguments in academia, right? Those of us that have been pushing for online education for years, now suddenly everyone was forced into it, and we're
Right.
like, you gotta stick with this. Don't go back into your sheltered world after this is over. And it's hard to do that.
It is, and I taught the very first online class. It wasn't, it was part of the main curriculum at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design in 1996, and it was on web design, and we had no tools like we have today. It was slow. It was, there were no visuals, there was no video, and so we were having online chats. Students had never, they never met me face to face or even saw what I looked like, actually. And, they thought, well, I can mess around with this, and not go to class. Well, a lot of people failed. So yeah, from the very beginning, I was looking at and experiencing these tools at a, basically a prehistoric level. And so things obviously have changed, and that's really good. Let's see, what else do I have here? One of the things that I mentioned earlier is that we, our public affairs office had different ideas about how to use online content than some of us. And early on, we were concerned. They initially started with the Twitter account. We had the blog. And as time developed, we started using Flickr. We started using, and I mean the museum. We had a number of Twitter accounts. We had, the blog. And so at a certain point, we started to realize, or at least I started to realize, that we were working in silos. And how to bring these silos together was another interesting challenge, especially when departments' philosophies of what this content was for was often very different. Now, I do know in our museum, public affairs and the new media technology team is all under one department. And so I think that facilitates conversations between, content providers and publicity. And I think I think there's much less of a silo there. Let's see. I wrote an article, I think it was for MCN, called "Confessions of a Long-Tail Visionary." And as I said earlier, this was something that Chris Anderson of Wired had talked about. And what I realized is that early on, we were playing a number of roles. People like myself, people in our departments, were playing a number of roles with this content. First, we were explorers. We were looking at connecting our content with the burgeoning social media sphere, and then we were advocates. We were trying to convince our coworkers that this was a very important shift in getting our information out there. We were going from a one-way conversation between the experts to the masses and to our visitors, to more of a two-way conversation. And I think even today, that's still a challenge. Even though people feel like they can say anything on Twitter, about anybody and anything, it's still there's still a mindset of the visitor as the consumer, rather than just not the consumer, but also somebody with an opinion. Uh,
Jeff, just one quick point.
yeah.
You talked about how the language changed when you were blogging. So I would imagine that you had to begin to change the language again with the two-way interaction with the public
Yeah.
for the different platforms that you had.
Yes. Social media is a much more informal set of platforms, and if you look at the traditional hierarchy of the museum, the curators and the art historians are near the top, and I've attended enough College Art Association meetings to know how art historians talk. And it's never been, as a teacher and as an advocate within a museum situation, I've always been much more interested in making sure that we're understood when we talk about the content that we have, that we're talking to people in ways that they will understand and ways that they can react, to us. We certainly are not going to do that if we talk in art history ease. I do remember a wonderful a panel that I attended at CAA many, many years ago. When I was doing my graduate work at UCLA, I studied with T.J. Clark, art historian, very well-known art historian, Marxist bent, and there were a group of art historians on this panel, and he finally said, "Look, if you want to convey this information, get it out there, get it accepted, you're going to have to start talking in terms that people can understand." And afterwards I went up to him. I think it probably was at least 20 years after I had a class with him, and I said, now I remember why I liked you. I know you don't remember who I am. And he goes, I do remember you. You used to ask a lot of questions. And I said, yeah, that was me. But that was very, very important in changing how we spoke to our audiences. Now, that did not stop, academic catalogs, good writing. That's still the norm. I think it will always be the norm. But finding a place for informal conversations is really, really important. And here are two examples. Our Luce Center, which would show part of our collection that was normally would be not seen by the public. Maybe 40% of Art Museum's collection, and that might even be a large percentage, is ever shown within the museum walls or a museum wall. Most of it is, hidden away. So this open storage, Luce Open Storage Center allowed us to show a lot of work that might never have been seen in these simple glass cases with very little contextual information. There wasn't a long caption. It was an artist and a name. You could go to a kiosk and find out more about that. But oftentimes, a work that was in this Luce Center would be needed for an exhibition, a traveling exhibition. And so suddenly there would be a gap. There would be an empty space. So what we did is, working with the Luce Center, is through Twitter, I think it was Twitter, yes, we started if I say program, it sounds too organized, but it was called uh, either Fill the Gap, Mind the Gap, where we asked people to suggest works from our collection that could fill that gap. So that was an early way that we could connect and get people involved, get our viewers involved actively in what we displayed. A second program, for years before we any talk of digital, we had a program called Ask Joan of Art. And this was where somebody could write into one of our researchers, our main, there really was an Ask Joan of Art. There really was a Joan of Art. And ask about something, and they would do research on it and get back to them. They would often use, a lot of sources that were not available to the public. So I discovered, and this was just, by chance, I discovered that the researcher who was doing this, her name was Kathleen Adrian, had started a Twitter account on her own. She didn't ask anybody. She just started doing it. And in any sort of museum or corporate world, the question is, do you just do it and ask for forgiveness later? Or do you have to go and ask for permission? So I was blown away that she was doing this. And what she was doing was she was tweeting questions. That's it, just questions, to the public. And I said to her, well, wait a minute. What if we started to take those questions and on our website create an Ask Joan of Art page where we would answer those questions? You've already got the content. Now, that was really important. We were repurposing content that she and other researchers had already done for years. So talk about bringing hidden content back up to the surface. We had to be careful that we weren't using proprietary information. But this was very popular. We did a study. We had 3,600 people who were accessing these pages within a couple years. Well, it may not seem like much now, but back then it was quite a bit, in the mid 2000s. And in fact, it started to get so large a repository that we were afraid that we would start, that our information, that our content was going to start to be buried once again from all of this information. But that's another example of how we started to bring content that might normally never see the light of day up to the surface. Now, what we decided to do when these pages got long, is we decided that this would be a category within the blog. And our blog, of course, was coming up with new blog posts all the time, and we just made it a category. So if people wanted to look, by category, that was simple for them to do. So those are two examples of how we brought content up early in this technology area. Let's see, what else do I have? One of the things, I was talking about the roles we played. We were explorers, we were advocates, we were collaborators. I've spoken about that, how it was important for us to find ways to collaborate with others in the museum. But we were also community organizers, bringing new people into the process. And I'd like to think that my teaching experience, I was a college professor for 23 years, allowed me to think in terms of how do I convey this information, to somebody who has no idea what I'm talking about. And yet, another role we played was being a realist. We had to realize that we could never hope to move as quickly as we would like to. Part of my job was to look into the future. Part of many of our jobs was to do just that. What was coming down the pike? How realistic was it? After the balloon bust in Silicon Valley, in the late 90s, it's like, okay, a lot of these things may not work out, so we had to start considering, how we assessed new technologies. Now I think it's a little bit, it has coalesced a little bit. You've got things like virtual VR and AR, and it may not be where we want it to be at the moment, but we can see advantages, especially built on our successes and failures in the last 20 years. So that was
Hey, Jeff, can I jump in with a quick question there?
yeah.
When you talk about building on successes and failures, right? So for many museums, this is about building that institutional, those staff members who know how to work with technologies. What do you think? I mean, fewer and fewer museums have that institutional knowledge now. It's more and more that's being outsourced. I'm curious to know your thoughts on that after having been that knowledge for your museum for so long. Does that worry you?
Well, actually, that is a really good question and leads me to something else I was going to talk about, another sort of case study. Not from the beginning, but certainly soon after the beginning, yes, a lot of companies, new media, interactive companies started to develop. Everybody wanted an app. Everybody wanted an app. We've got to have an app, and it's like, well, how much time do we have in the tech people in the museum? So we did outsource. We outsourced websites from the very beginning. But what we needed was, within our organization, people who could be the intermediary between these outsourced organizations and the project managers, the stakeholders of these projects. And here's a perfect example. In 2011, I worked on a project for our museum and the National Museum of African American History and Culture. We worked together on doing a website. I think it was mainly for teachers on African American art. It was called O Freedom. And when I spoke to the project manager about what, I was the tech person. When I spoke to the project manager about what her needs were, one of them was the ability to upload lesson plans, to have some sort of interaction between teachers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This was not something that we could manufacture in-house. So I went looking for a CMS that would fit most of their goals, especially those two primary goals. And I found one in Omeka. Now, okay, well, wait a minute. Okay, so I'm going to admit something. I, I had never worked with a content management system at that level, at the development level before. So I picked this, and then I went looking for the directories. Well, there weren't directories, you know, and it was database driven. I didn't know what the hell I was doing. Not only that, but I had thought, because I was thinking more in traditional web design, that I would redesign a website based on what their needs were. How could I do this? I didn't know PHP. I didn't know, MySQL. I didn't know any of this. And by the way, I want to take a one step back before I go on with the story, and that is that as these content management systems develop, remember that the Smithsonian is basically a parent-child organization. We have a lot of museums and study centers, but we have a main Smithsonian, and for years they have been the area that handles the requirements, the security. Security has gotten much more important. But they were very concerned early on about using PHP and MySQL, for security reasons. So we did have to go out, and we did have to host these things. That's why TypePad was so good for our blog. Now, of course, we're using Drupal and we're using WordPress, and the situation has changed quite a bit. Anyway, so this had to be the most nightmarish project I ever worked on. I was so every night I came home thinking I was going to fail gloriously, and luckily I was able to reach out to people within the larger Smithsonian community to help me. Please, can you get in and do this in PHP? I didn't have time to learn it, whatever, but I felt so inadequate. But it worked. We made it work. But the important story here in this context is I realized that Omeka worked in a particular way. Now, I was using Omeka when it first came out, Omeka 1.0. The plugins were 1.0. We had written, everything for 1.0. Then they came out with 2.0 that actually solved some of our problems, except that the plugins wouldn't work in 1.0. And I had worked with, I had gone through so much hell with getting this to work 1.0. I didn't want to mess with the structure that we had done. So I had to go to the project manager. For example, we had to enter data. This was solved with 2.0, but we were using 1.0. We had to enter data in the exact order we wanted it to appear on the page. We could not reorganize it. We could not move that order. And so I became the project manager that spoke to the project manager and said, here are our limitations. We can only do it this way. So I need for you to finalize the order on which of which you want this to appear on the page. And if it changes, we're going to have to redo everything from the beginning. Does that make sense? Okay. So what I realized is that I was basically the technology project manager. I knew the application. I knew the limits of the application. And I had to convey that in a way that the content producers would understand and would listen to, you know. So that's a great story on how technology interfaced with content producers and the limitations that we had. Now, there still there are always limitations. Look at Zoom. I can see that you're not using a green screen, Paul, because I can see, yes, I can see that. Yes, exactly. But we always have to consider what those limitations are and how to work around them. And I would say that has been my job. That was my job, being able to see. I spoke earlier about being able to see in the future about what was coming down the pike, but I also had to see in a shorter range future of how to understand, knowing and to understand how content producers worked. And we already knew from our past experience that things change right in the middle. No, I want this first. No, this has to be moved over here. I was not willing to sacrifice Omeka 1.0 and what we had for that. And so I needed to force that through and make that understood. So that gives you a sense of what we had to work with. And also that's a very good segue to another problem that everybody has, and that is, what your project is about. When people leave, as I did, when I retired, all of your knowledge goes with it. And I do remember in the few years before I retired, I was well, I certainly was the oldest person there, but I was also the person who had been there the longest. And there were times when I would say, well, wait a minute, way back when, we did this. And so institutional memory and memory loss is a real problem, is a challenge. Now the further away you get, certainly the issues that you were dealing with in the early 2000s, are far enough removed now. But 2010, we still have Omeka. We still have, people who do not want open source stuff. I do have another great story for you. And this story is about, I would call it, be careful what you ask for, be careful what you want. So the director decided that if we put on our front page of our website, and I can't remember exactly when this was, but it was probably the early 2000s, something like that. If we put something on our website that said free gift, if they signed up for a mailing list, because she wanted to grab these people, and a mailing list was the way to do it back then for her. And we would give people a set of cards, blank cards with envelopes. What do you call them? Whatever they're called. Okay. Uh, and so I said, okay. And we had a huge repository of these cards, in little sets. And we put pictures of what the cards were. Well, okay, it started out, I was watching, the traffic. It started out, we would get, maybe 50 a day, and then it went up to 100 a day. And then suddenly it jumped to 3,000 a day, and then 10,000 a day, and I'm going, we're all going, where the heck is this coming from? Well, I did some sleuthing, and I looked at when this really started to jump. And of course, we were wondering, we're going to run out. We're going to run out of cards, But I found a woman. I queried her. I sent her an email, and I said, did you pass on this information to anybody? And she goes, yes. One of the cards has a picture of a church on it. And so I posted this in a, religious website or something like that. That's why it happened. So, we were getting 20,000, signups a day. Of course, the director was just extremely happy, but we didn't know what to do. So anyway, there you go. Be careful what you ask for. Just to show you where we are now, and this happened before I left, but now we're into linked open data, and so it is wonderful to be able to have been in this area long enough to see, an actual trajectory of how this worked. And I should say, just as an addendum, one of the reasons we were one of the first to have a website, and the person who I mentioned earlier was schooling our director, was Steve Dietz. Steve was the head of publications and whatever they called it, and I came in, I actually had a web design company, and I was doing some websites for them, and we got along very well. They were they were very surprised we got along so well. And afterwards, they said, "Would you be interested in this job?" Steve is leaving. They were reorganizing everything, and I was going to be under Thorny Staples. I don't know if you know Thorny.
Yeah, I know Thorny.
Yes, but Thorny, talk about. You should speak to him, because in terms of repositories and what he was trying to do, first at American Art, then he went back to University of Virginia, then he came back to the museum, not to the museum, but to the Smithsonian, and now he's retired. But you could really, really be talking to him as well, And one last thing, and then I'll let you go. And Paul, I have to tell you that when you came to help us, this committee that we had, Pan-Smithsonian Committee with what's her name from American History.
With Judy Greywall, right? When I came and did some of the usability stuff.
Usability studies.
Right.
And we the question that, I don't know if you posed it, I think you did, is like, okay, we brought people in, you want to go see an IMAX, here's the website, how do you find the IMAX? Well, what came out of that, it never went anyplace, but I actually wrote about how the Washington Post should not be listing their movies by theater in the paper. They should be listing by times. At the time, we had young children, and we needed to know what movies could we see when we could get a babysitter. And I actually wrote about that, and then I wrote them saying that's the way that you should have, another way you should organize your material. And it's all because of that experience. I want you to know that.